Welcome to the Virtual Reality Podcast. This is Craig Herndon, and I'm here with Brian Cohn. He is a graduate fellow at the National Science Program, a computer science PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. He's also the founder and chief scientist of Kaspect, a strategic consultancy for artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Brian and I just met at the Reality Virtually Hackathon, where his team moved to improve won Best in VR. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Craig. It was a pretty big surprise that we won. It was pretty exciting. But I think we spent a lot of time putting product together, and we found out that there's a gap, really, between physical therapists and the amount of time they have and the amount of care that you can get to someone who has something like a shoulder injury, upper extremity, and creating that whole experience in VR and making it reasonably easy for a physical therapist to make a VR task. It actually makes a lot of sense. So we're excited that the judges saw they saw our inspiration and they saw kind of like what we're getting at. And ultimately, we hope we can turn it into something real.
Yeah, and so your experience at the hackathon, so you bring a neuroscience part of it. So like,
Definitely.
What was your team formation like, and what kind of skills did you end up working with to really bring your idea to fruition? Like, where did it start at the hackathon before it ended up where it did?
Definitely. I didn't come in with a strong idea at the start. I just knew I wanted to do something that would help a patient in some capacity. Through some of my research and through the past few years, I've worked with quite a different number of patient populations and learned about different motor diseases in particular. And so with this one, I just knew I wanted to do something maybe with motor, maybe something with memory, or that would challenge patients in a new way. And I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know what angle I wanted to come from. But I was excited to meet other people who could bring their own kind of world to it. And so I started going around and meeting different people. And eventually I actually went out to lunch with a big group of people from the hackathon and just happened to sit next to a faculty at University of Delaware who works in physical therapy. And in her personal experience, she went through she had broken her clavicle, and so she had to go through many painful surgeries, many weeks of physical therapy. So she had a personal experience that challenged her, her own mental stability, and of course, it takes a lot of effort to go through
Physical therapy
something like
is
physical therapy.
Taxing both emotionally, physically, and
Financially.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not always accessible to people. Of course, if you don't have a reason to go there and you're not seeing improvement, it's going to be really hard to justify the pain and expense and time it takes to really get good rehabilitation. And that's not just for shoulder. Of course, it's also for other upper extremity motor diseases. Take, for example, shoulder disease or like breaking your arm. All of those require a lot of physical therapy. Some more permanent things like developing Parkinson's disease or different types of maybe a stroke, for example. And also lifelong disability, such as people affected by cerebral palsy, where moving a lot and getting into every part of the range of motion could make a big difference for them. So I think that when we first were starting our team together, she and I realized, we'd be able to make a pretty decent team together. And we slowly just started raising our hand and saying, hey, we're looking for someone with design experience because we want to make something that looks good. Hey, we're looking for someone with development experience because we want to make something that operates well. And finally, we wanted to get some people who have a little bit more like the science side. So we had this huge group of people around us and a couple other groups that were doing other biotechnology ideas. And eventually we we would talk with each person, find out what they're interested in, just get inspired over and over and over again. It's very clear that if you bring a lot of people together, like we did at this Reality Virtually event, you can really quickly identify problems in one area and solve them with another angle. I think that was pretty surprising for me.
How did that focus of the Reality Virtually being like XR, could this have been done in another medium, or is there actually an advantage to using XR for this physical therapy idea that you went with?
Right. Well, of course, there's a saying that if you only have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So if there's an intention of using a specific technology to solve something, it does limit creative thinking in a lot of ways. However, the limitation in itself can forge a new opportunity that maybe we never even thought of. So when it comes to whether or not you could use VR, XR, AR, or some other type of hackathon, would you get similar output? I think really it's up to the people to identify whether or not there's traditional value being produced through the new technology. Of course, if you ask someone if they want a power drill versus a screwdriver, maybe the screwdriver is fine. And so it's important to know whether or not it actually makes sense to do something more complicated and understand the value propositions for a given group of people that would actually make a difference in their life or a difference in their company or business. So I've been to a couple hackathons where they ask us to use a specific type of SDK, and they're very adamant on us using that SDK, often with industry support. And it could be very hard because you might think, we can make a sharing application with their application, but it might actually be easier to do some things on paper or with the U.S. Postal Office. So I think it's important always to look at the value that people get and understand that while you may be limiting someone with a given technology, you can always expand their horizons by just involving them in the patient space on the other side.
So let's talk about your experience where the use case was a patient who is hurt, like, for example, the shoulder cuff. A physical therapist could come in and then rotate the wrist in the direction that they would want. So the patient would be holding a Vive controller. So as you turn that, then in the visual experience, they see like little dots show up of lines that they need to trace. And then from there, you would make something like a fish that when they completed all those dots would appear and then like animate. So there's like a reward system.
Yeah, it starts swimming. It starts swimming and animated. Yeah, it's a very gratuitous way to describe our connect the dots experience. But it really is. It's 3D connect the dots with your arm, and then you're just deciding where those dots show up as a physical therapist. Because if you want someone to practice more above their head, then you move the points up there. But if you want them to practice, more longitudinally or in front of them, then you'd actually be able to stretch the fish or stretch whatever animal shape or anything you can imagine, really, and they'd be able to practice in that area. And that's a big part of accessibility in XR. That's really a huge opportunity. Is that there are many people who cannot use traditional controllers or traditional input systems. Even the menu systems a lot of times require incredible dexterity just to press the trigger. And for someone who's got who suffered a stroke, for example, that might not even be an option. So it's cool creating an application for this hackathon where someone with a stroke could just has to hold the controller or have it taped to their hand, and immediately they're able to move across this whole space. And if it turns out they can't hit all the points, they can just press a button to make the task a little bit smaller, a little bit easier for them, so it's a little bit less taxing on them. And as they progress and get better, the clinician can just press a button, and now it's a little bit more challenging, moving them to the edges of their range of motion.
So your application could also be collecting data about how accurately they're able to move or how quickly they're able to trace those lines. Could the physician then be able to read or interpret that to understand how the patient's doing over time?
Definitely. It's really important that people have fun when they're doing this, right? So, of course, firstly, just give them a score, give them some feedback, but then how do you turn that feedback into something that the clinician can use to guide the treatment? So that reminds me of a project I'm working on at USC with a PI of Sarah Ingersoll, and that's in the Department of Neurology at USC. And we have a VR study to evaluate the effectiveness of VR data collection of tremor. And so something we identified we have a big team, but we identified that if you hold the controller, your tremor is actually apparent through the controller very readily. And if you move across the space, you can also collect data on how much shaking there is during movement and during static tasks. And that using the data from the Vive or from other VR systems, you can actually use that tracked data to interpret the shakiness. And that's a pretty quantitative metric of how their motor function is. And that's
because in virtual reality, you're always able to set the context such that it is apples to apples, and it's not comparing different situations.
Exactly. It's a data collection device. I mean, at the end of the day, what's happening with the lighthouses and with the outside-in tracking or inside-out tracking is data collection. And over the frequencies that they're operating, just like a game, the game needs data to drive the experience. And so what we do is we write the current position of the headset and different controllers into memory, and at the very end we save it to like a CSV file. And that can immediately be used to evaluate how much movement there is in different directions, identifying what's the shakiness. And actually, we found pretty good replicability across studies. That said, it is a commercial product, so it's not a professional product per se. So it's not designed to be a sub like sub micrometer level precision like other things on the market are. But I think for in the future, these things are moving forward and they're getting more accurate on a commercial level, and you could imagine having Parkinson's disease evaluation at home,
and which would then lower the cost, which is the financial piece that you were talking about earlier on how expensive rehabilitation is.
Definitely. And expense is a huge part of healthcare. It's one of the biggest expenditures doing these exams. And actually a good story to speak to that is that the VA in the US has a huge initiative in getting their veterans care through telemedicine, because with so few centers, with so many people, they have to pay people to get to their centers to receive treatment sometimes. That can be really expensive. So there's actually examples of Parkinson's disease treatment being performed over the web, over Skype. And they can talk with the patient, have a full interview with them, identify what they're experiencing in their stiffness or their shaking, and identify whether or not they should change prescriptions all over the internet. And I think that ultimately, if you can do basic medical care through the internet, you could also probably do basic therapeutic care. And you could also deliver therapies at their home. So you can imagine receiving not a prescription in the mail, but a little headset in the mail that you just put on the wall, and every day you just put it on and go through a list of proctored and designed exercises that your clinician works with you to create.
So I think there are probably several listeners that just bailed out at the whole data collection device. They're like, XR is not for me because people feel burned by data collection. But this particular use case would be protected under HIPAA, correct?
So with with their study, everything's under HIPAA protocol already, because it's under an IRB committee as well. And I think that if it's you wouldn't want to be publishing, if you made a game for people who have Parkinson's disease, you wouldn't want to be publishing their high scores and their names. but it goes without saying that any device that's going to be on the market requires some level of oversight, whether that be with FDA or other organizations. And of course, the hospitals and clinics that are using these devices also have to comply with those standards. But I think that the infrastructure for safe healthcare over the web is really there. And I think that as long as the companies that show up in the next 10 years in the healthcare XR space, I think they should be able to pull off a safe
like these
transfer.
Commercial grade therapeutics, would they be subject to FDA approval, or would it be something that would be more like have an exemption but still fall under like HIPAA laws?
So I'm not an expert in that case per se,
lawyer.
right? Definitely. But what I can say is that there are some devices that are FDA exempt, depending upon if there's existing devices like them in the marketplace, and it's shown to have minimal additional risk than what's currently out there. And there's also different classes of medical devices, like ones that are really invasive, like surgical devices, or ones that are more less risky, right? Like things that wouldn't actually cause death or cause immense bleeding. That said, definitely standing up in a VR environment can get you pretty dizzy. So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to making these things safe. But building in elements of safety directly into the environment, I think that's going to make a big difference. In our prototype at the hackathon, we actually put in something pretty creative. We're working with one of our team members, Cameron, came up with this idea to slow them down by just putting up a huge screen that says slow down so they don't go too quickly and risk injuring their shoulder. And you could imagine creating lots of like software walls that keep them within the bounds of what safe therapy would be. So ultimately, when it comes to safety, I think that it's going to be both a hardware and a software approach, and then tying it all together with the clinics and the hospitals that are using these. I think it could also be a data safe environment for data collection.
And the areas that you're looking at are very unique, and it seems like a unique concoction of your skills and backgrounds from your experience at Kaspect to neuroscience. At what point did VR experience come into that mixture to bring you to the Reality Virtually Hackathon?
when it comes to VR, I think of myself still as a scientist, and I still think within every update frame that's going through the computer, is there something important that I could be saving to the disk that I could use to inform something scientific, like reaction time or visual ability or acuity or memory. And I'm always trying to think about ways to experiment and understand better the human condition and use VR as a method to understand that better. Whether that be something about proprioception or motor disease or even optimality or getting faster and getting more flexible or more strong. So I think that going forward, I do see a lot of parallels between artificial intelligence and XR, because XR is on your head, it's on your face, it's in your world, and any opportunity to take very good inferences from the world around you and bring them closer to your body, I think that's a good opportunity. Of course, there's risks involved with any technology, but I think there's a lot of benefits that we can look forward to.
So going back to like the data and the problems of collecting data is just like something that developers right now kind of need to listen. What we're saying is not to collect everything so you can figure out how to use it later, because that's what makes people nervous. Is like, why are you collecting all this data? So you really need to look at what am I trying to improve, and only collect as you need. And even if you're just doing the analysis locally on their machine so it never leaves the user's computer, and that way you're still making these decisions and figuring out, like, do I really need all this data to make the decisions and improvements that I need? And can it be done in a way that's more anonymized if I do need to take it off their machine?
Exactly.
And just keep that in the back of your mind. Actually, keep it on the front of your mind, because there's a lot going on that people are not trusting. If you look at like the Oculus runtime and just look at all the data that's going over, even like the Oculus app recently, someone said that all they did was have it on. They only used it to add friends, and it used up several gigs of their phone data. Like, they just realized that their phone data capped out, and they couldn't figure out why. And it was because of the Oculus app was just collecting all this data. It's like, what are you doing there, Facebook?
Right. What's the intention?
Like, I wasn't even using your app. Like, why is this? And I think, I don't know if I'm not really one to have a opinion right now over like what's the best way to do this. But I just wanted to make the point that it's something that should be on the front of all of our minds.
There's been more than a handful of situations with consulting where I've seen that companies want to collect as much data as possible because they feel it would be an opportunity lost if they weren't to collect everything they could. However, sometimes it makes more sense to identify the key problems, and like very much in a Six Sigma kind of sense, identifying the pain points and the specific choke points for processes and places where variability is high and failure is high. So often I've found that data doesn't have to be big to make a big change. Sometimes a very, very small change can make a huge difference. And it could be as simple as running user studies in person as opposed to trying to collect as much data as possible. But I found that in general, for a lot of business decisions, it's about choosing the right data and curating that data as cleanly as possible rather than trying to create the best data out of everything that's collected. Ultimately, people just end up being hired to go through the data with the hope that they're creating value as opposed to looking for data with the hopes of creating good value.
Yeah, and I like to just summarize it, as I've already said, is collect as needed and in a smart scientific way.
Right, and have some precedent. I think it's really important to have precedent because, take for example, you want to understand how people use your website. There's precedent for that. You can actually look up research studies, published papers, go into very express detail on how many data points you need on an A/B test before you should say, okay, let's go with A. And so there's a lot of algorithms out there that you can use to your advantage to make data really worth your while with the minimum amount of data possible.
So after all of this, coming to Hackathon and meeting a team and coming out with a really cool thing you hadn't even thought of before, what was your takeaway from this hackathon?
I was really surprised with the level of polish we were able to create in just a few days. Most of the projects I've worked on in the past at hackathons or in quick small groups are pretty rough. They don't look good. They don't feel right. There's a lot of whenever someone comes to try it, I have to say, oh, make sure you don't press this button because it'll crash this whole thing. But this time it actually seemed to work. And I was pretty proud of myself, proud of our team, and proud of the relationships and friendships that I've built with these other 4 members of the team, because I think that it's inspiring to know that there's so much that can be done, and it's not a technical barrier to it anymore. It's not nearly as high as it used to be, and I think there's a lot that can be done. That was probably my biggest takeaway.
And for people that are interested and want to follow up with you, collaborate, or just learn more about your projects, like where can they go?
Right,
how
definitely.
They do it?
If people are interested in hearing more about my projects or want to reach out to me to collaborate, definitely head to my website, my personal website. It's briancohn.com, briancohn.com. And there's a link to email me, and there's other information, cool links to research and videos and all sorts of things.
All right, excellent. I want to thank you for your time. This has been another episode of the Virtuality Podcast. We'll see you in this reality.
And the next.
Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, virtuality.show.